This episode of The Reality Check is brought to you by HelloFresh. Forget takeout. HelloFresh delivers all the ingredients for delicious, healthy meals anyone can prepare at home in less than 30 minutes. And HelloFresh is giving our Canadian checkers 50% off their first order. Go to hellofresh.ca and use promo code REALITY50 to get 50% off your first order. That's hellofresh.ca, promo code REALITY50. This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for August 29th, 2017, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, not quite as usual, is Adam Gardner.
What's up, cuboids?
And with me in person is Cristina Roach.
Hello.
And producer Pat.
Hi, everyone.
We have an interesting show for you today. We thought with all the recent events happening in Houston and Texas, we would talk about hurricanes. So I'm going to talk about hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones, what the difference is. Adam is going to explore climate change in hurricanes, and Cristina will look into the complications with evacuating during emergencies. As listeners probably well know, Hurricane Harvey has wrought devastation on southeast Texas, causing at least 10 deaths, at least $30 billion in damages, and the area will take years to recover due to all the flooding. You've heard the terms hurricane, typhoon, and cyclone, but what's the difference? Well, the only difference is the location of the storm, for it is the same weather phenomenon. Quoting the U.S. National Ocean Service, in the Atlantic and the Northeast Pacific, the term hurricane is used. The same type of disturbance in the Northwest Pacific is called a typhoon, and cyclones occur in the South Pacific and Indian Ocean. The ingredients for these storms include a pre-existing weather disturbance, warm tropical oceans, moisture, and relatively light winds. If the right conditions persist long enough, they can combine to produce the violent winds, incredible waves, torrential rains, and floods. Those are hurricane, typhoon, and cyclone. What about a tornado? Because I think people often get this one confused a bit in there as well. The Hurricane Society, which you can find this link on our website, trcpodcast.com, has a nice chart I'm going to read from that compares hurricanes and tornadoes. The main takeaway, though, is that the only similarity between tornadoes and hurricanes is that they both contain strong rotating winds that can cause damage. So I talked about where the hurricanes are from. Where tornadoes are from is that they form over land. That's the main point. And how big they are, well, hurricanes can be up to several hundred meters wide, and tornadoes are usually less than a quarter mile wide. How long they last? Well, a hurricane can be up to 3 weeks, and tornadoes are usually no more than an hour. As for the winds, hurricanes are typically less than 180 miles an hour, or 300 kilometers an hour, while tornadoes, the most severe ones, can be up to 300 miles an hour, which is 500 kilometers an hour. As for occurrences, there's about 10 tropical storms in the Atlantic Ocean regarding hurricanes. And in the United States, there are 800 to 1,000 tornadoes.
Oh, wow.
Hurricanes typically, in terms of advance warning, have about several days, while tornadoes are usually no more than 15 to 30 minutes.
Darren, is it fair to say that tornadoes also often sort of cluster or occur close together in time and space?
That's a good question. I think it's probably true more so than hurricanes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, listeners, you may have noticed that Hurricane Harvey is now called Tropical Storm Harvey, and that is because of the change in the surface wind speed. Different speeds are categorized differently. A tropical storm is one in which the maximum sustained surface wind speed ranges from 63 kilometers an hour to 118 kilometers an hour, which is about 40 miles an hour to 73 miles an hour. Once it goes beyond this, it becomes a hurricane, typhoon, or cyclone, depending on location. If it is less in terms of speed, it is called a tropical depression. Now, scientists don't really know exactly how a hurricane forms. As I alluded to before, there's two main ingredients: warm water. Warm ocean waters provide the energy a storm needs. And the other ingredient is that winds that don't change much in speed or direction as they go up in the sky. Because winds that change a lot can actually rip the storms themselves apart. We're now going to turn to Adam, who's going to talk to us about climate change and hurricanes.
Thanks, Darren. Following some of the conversations surrounding Hurricane Harvey, some people are citing climate change as a factor, while others are discounting such concerns as being nonsense. I thought it would be a good time to look at what the potential link between global warming and hurricanes might be, what the research suggests, and how this could potentially have affected Hurricane Harvey. Climate change and global warming are, of course, divisive political issues, where someone's belief system seems to greatly influence their likelihood of believing or being skeptical of the scientific evidence for such phenomenon. I am no expert on this topic, but I trust in the research of those who are, and the scientific consensus on this topic is very clear. The Earth is warming, and the recent drastic increases in temperature are caused by humans. The data supports this assertion. If you disagree with this, then you probably won't be on board with a lot of my segment. A lot of this analysis comes from a Facebook post by Michael E. Mann. This is not the director of such hit films as Heat, but rather a professor of atmospheric science at Penn State and the director of the Earth System Science Center. The first factor which affected the severity of the flooding is that sea levels have risen as a result of climate change. John Nielsen Gammon, a climatologist of Texas A&M University in College Station, has determined that the rise of the sea level in the Texas Gulf Coast, which is near Houston, where Hurricane Harvey caused flooding, has risen enough to cause an additional 7 inches of water during a storm surge as compared to 30 years ago. So all else being equal, if Hurricane Harvey had occurred 30 years ago, there would have been 7 inches less flooding. While with some areas in Houston currently under 10 to 15 feet of water, this may not seem like much, but for areas with lower levels of water, this could be a significant difference. There has also been an increase in the temperature of the water at the surface of the ocean in the area. Darren mentioned that warm water was a factor causing hurricanes. So this increases the temperature by about 0.5 degrees Celsius. Increased sea surface temperatures cause increased levels of atmospheric moisture. A 0.5 degree increase means about 3% higher moisture. Since the sea surface temperature at the time that Hurricane Harvey intensified was about 0.5 to 1 degree Celsius warmer than the average, the total increase in moisture was about 3 to 5%. Some of that is simply because it was a warmer day than the average, but some of that was because the area is warmer now than it was decades ago due to human-caused global warming. So moisture means more rainfall, and that means more flooding. There is also more warm water below the surface, which fed Hurricane Harvey while it intensified, which causes stronger winds and a stronger storm surge. The major reason for which Houston was flooded, however, doesn't have so much to do with the intensity of the storm, but the fact that it was stalled over the same area for days rather than being pushed out back to sea. The storm was not pushed out by the weak prevailing winds, and instead it sort of wobbled around, moving without a clear direction, and stayed near the same place. Michael Mann explains that this is associated with a subtropical high-pressure system, which is over much of the U.S. The jet stream is pushed to the north, and this pattern, he says, is predicted by human-made climate change simulation models. So the fact that that storm stayed there so long is partially related to climate change, which is what made some of that flooding worse. In general, it seems that stationary weather patterns are more common with human-caused climate change. However, it isn't clear that this was a large factor in this particular hurricane, but it could be an issue in the future. Having a hurricane that stays in one place is really bad for people in that one place, but potentially better for people who are in other places where it doesn't really get to as much. The conclusion drawn by Michael Mann, who is certainly an expert in this field, is that while climate change cannot be said to be responsible for Hurricane Harvey, but due to many factors, its impact appears to have been considerably worse than it would have been otherwise, which increases the damage and loss of life.
Adam, just a quick note on a hurricane staying in the same place regarding Harvey. The estimate is something like 50 trillion liters of water.
Wow.
Jeez.
This is a number I have like no basis in reality for, but yeah,
it's 3 to 4 times more than Katrina.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Wow.
And that was devastating. Well, that was devastating for a lot of reasons. There were issues with dams and locks and stuff like that, right? The Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory concluded that they could not say that climate change to date has caused a detectable change in hurricane activity. This isn't to say that there hasn't been a change, but simply that if there was one, that it can't be detected because of large variability in hurricanes due to natural causes. Now, there may be some changes which have already occurred, which will only be noted after modeling over a longer time frame. But when it comes to the future, the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory makes some estimates of anticipated changes by the end of the 21st century, so that's within roughly 100 years. They predict with an over 66% chance that by then tropical cyclones will increase in intensity. Different models give different estimates of this impact ranging from 2 to 11%. They note that this will result in even larger destructive potentials per storm, even if they were the same size. Now, how does this make any sense? The analogy I can think of is that if I hit something with twice as much force, it will do more damage than simply hitting something twice with the initial amount of force, if that makes any sense. Another way of looking at it is 100-kilometer winds are more than twice as bad as 50-kilometer winds from a damage point of view.
Mm-hmm.
They also give a more than 50% likelihood that there will be an increase in the occurrence of very intense tropical storms in some basins. This would be much greater than the 2 to 11% that they cited earlier. It's expected that this will accompany either a small decrease or little change in the number of tropical cyclones. It is also estimated that tropical cyclones will have between 10% and 50% more rainfall than they do today, within 100 kilometers from the storm center. Now, as Michael Mann has mentioned, with rising sea levels, this needs to be considered for storms near coastal areas. The Center for Climate and Energy Solution estimates that globally, sea levels are expected to rise by some 1 to 4 feet, or 30 to 120 centimeters over the next century. 7 additional inches in Houston wasn't nice, but another 1 to 4 feet would be that much more devastating. They also note an increase in storms and hurricanes coming out of the North Atlantic Basin since 2000 due to a rise in Atlantic sea surface temperatures like we saw with Hurricane Harvey. The issue here is that increases depend on the basin where climate change can affect different ones differently. So it seems like the North Atlantic Basin, the ones that affect Houston and other areas in the U.S., is seeing an increase in hurricane intensity. Now, following this idea, the journal Nature shows that stronger hurricanes have increased in intensity over the past 20 to 30 years in the North Atlantic and Indian Oceans, but other areas in the Pacific and Indian Oceans have shown no changes. So this can get kind of complicated. You can't make blanket statements about changes across the world because weather's really complicated, but people do model these kind of things. Some models show no change or a small reduction in the frequency of hurricanes, but others show a trade-off where there are less overall storms but more intense hurricanes. Such models predict a 75% increase in Category 4 and 5 hurricanes, despite a small decrease in all storms in the Atlantic Basin. So climate change is bad for a lot of reasons. Increases in the intensity and impact of hurricanes is just one of them, as Hurricane Harvey seems to be just one example. So much to say, there's nothing cool about global warming.
Thanks, Adam. As you point out, it can be very tricky to attribute particular weather events to overall trends in climate change, but it does highlight that climate change tends to exacerbate most weather events in terms of causing negative damage and whatnot. If a hurricane is hovering over a town, so to speak, but as you mentioned, the sea level rise will cause numerous problems in numerous places, from Bangladesh to the coast of the United States to different parts of Asia. It's not quite clear how to easily do something about this. Someone I was talking to recently, like, well, can't they just, use technology to get the hurricane to move? And it's like, well, no, we're not quite there yet. And as you could imagine, anything that would have the capability of doing that in terms of technology would have numerous potential downsides as well, let alone if it falls into malevolent hands.
No kidding.
Well, I think getting rid of a hurricane through technology may be difficult and challenging. That's not to say there aren't ways that we can sort of use resources and money and planning to avoid the impact. There are ways cities are built that can make them more or less at risk. There are ways buildings can be built. There are cities that do that better than others, and because of that, there are cities that are more at risk than others.
You're right. Yeah,
so
I came across that a lot when I was researching my segment as well.
Yeah. So maybe you're not going to make a hurricane destruction ray or something like that, but you can fortify your city and maybe, I don't know, have a different kind of evacuation strategy or something like that. But
mitigating some of the damage. And there's also, of course, the privilege of just location where one lives. So I typically live in Ottawa, and there was a tornado warning the other day, but it's exceptionally rare that anything like that happens in a lot of Canada. But as you mentioned, Adam, some mitigating factors can be done regarding evacuation strategies. Now we'll turn to Cristina to tell us more about that.
During press updates this past weekend, Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner was challenged on the decision to not call for an earlier evacuation of Harris County. Although the city anticipated heavy rain, it was not in Hurricane Harvey's direct path. Turner argued that an evacuation of Harris County, which is experiencing unprecedented flooding, would have led to much worse problems. Here's a quote from his press conference on Saturday. "Quite frankly, leaving your homes, getting on the streets, you'll be putting yourself in more danger and not making yourself safer. And so we're just asking people to hunker down." On Sunday, he stood by his decision, saying, quote, "If you think the situation right now is bad, you give an order to evacuate, you are creating a nightmare. especially when it's not planned. If you do it or attempt to do it and it's not coordinated, not done right, you are literally putting people in harm's way and you're creating a far worse situation. When you combine Houston and Harris County, you literally cannot put 6.5 million people on the road.
Oh.
Yeah, that's crazy. Now, I saw quite a bit of jibber jabber about this on Twitter. Many area residents and those who lived through Hurricane Rita called out any outside critics who suggested residents should have evacuated earlier. Here's an example of some back and forth tweets on the City of Houston Twitter feed. So these were comments that were made under a video of the mayor defending his decision. "Oh my God, mayor did not order an evacuation? This is a tragedy. Pray for people of Houston and solely blame the mayor for any life loss."
Right.
Another said, "At Greg Abbott was right, should have left the city, shaking my head." Greg Abbott is the governor of Texas who was actually kind of challenging or sending mixed messages about the evacuation orders. And here are some replies. "Were you here during Rita? I was, and it was nuts. People died on the roads waiting. This storm was huge. Where were people supposed to go?" Another, "Not everyone has assistance to leave. Not everyone was released from their jobs. Not everyone has flexibility to predict the future." And another, 107 people died during Rita evacuations. And I'll get that to a bit later.
Wow.
Yeah, it was surprising to hear that many people died just in the evacuations.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously a touchy subject considering the impact these decisions have on millions of people's lives. Now, to be clear, there doesn't seem to currently be consensus whether local leaders made the right call, and it's something that could be debated forever. But it seems easy to be critical from a distance or make assumptions that evacuation orders should have been implemented, especially since this is a field of study that uses hard data. The reality is that there are a myriad of considerations before issuing any evacuation orders, as well as consequences. Arian Marshall just did a great overview of this for Wired yesterday. The article is aptly called "The Agony of Deciding to Evacuate a City," and I thought a quick overview may help provide some perspective. Says Brian Wolshan, a transportation engineer who studies evacuations at Louisiana State University, "Evacuations are enormously costly and disruptive, not just to the areas that are being evacuated, but to the areas they're going to. It's a tough call to get right." He adds that Houston has one of the most robust and detailed evacuation plans he knew, addressing questions like which roadways were best to use, when should highways be converted to send lanes in the same directions to aid with a huge evacuation. Susan Cutter, a geographer who studies disaster vulnerability at the University of South Carolina, says there is a lot of pre-planning that goes into how to manage evacuations, including how they will be implemented, timing, how long it takes people to get out of their homes and on the road. Evacuation plans depend on highly detailed population data and the most recent demographics of a city. For instance, how many people live in your city? How many have access to cars or have pets? How many seniors or people with disabilities need help with transportation? Evacuations, as you guys can imagine, are especially stressful for the elderly. There are also different plans for different neighborhoods, and even though detailed mathematical models are used to predict the best course of action, variables can change quickly. Now, add to that the unpredictability of how humans will react. A lot of people stay put no matter what they're told, right? And also, evacuating an area costs about $1 million per mile of coastline. It's complicated. So the first consideration in evacuation decisions, obviously, is a weather forecast and the movement of a storm. If a city is in the direct path of a hurricane, it's more likely to trigger an evacuation than a city that is threatened with flooding as a result of a storm. And as I said earlier, Harris County was not in the direct path of Hurricane Harvey.
Well, and if your city is threatened with flooding, it may also depend where you live in that city. If you live near water or you're in a low elevation point, you're definitely affected. But if you're at the top of the hill, it's probably not a big problem.
Then there's the human factor, travel behavior. More recently, researchers are studying how local residents may react to social media during events like this. But for now, public agencies have to predict how many people may go to public shelters versus getting hotels or staying with friends and family. They also have to predict how many police officers are needed to direct traffic, how much staff is available to get fuel to stalled vehicles, how many tow trucks do we need to move cars that are broken down on jam-packed roads.
Cities have something called clearance times, which refers to how long it would take for all the residents to clear out. Now, obviously, this varies depending on location and the severity of the storm. But as an example, a bad storm in a smaller place like Mobile, Alabama, which has few major thoroughfares, would need days to get everyone out. Whereas a city like Houston would need about 60 hours. And if you make the wrong call, you may be stranding people on the highway. Considering the majority of flood-related deaths are said to happen inside cars, that could be disastrous. Marshall Shepard, a program director in atmospheric sciences at the University of Georgia, says, quote, "People disproportionately die in cars from floods, so evacuation is not as straightforward a call as it seems." Or you may be sending your residents to an area that is hit harder than the area they left. Who wants to be the mayor who told his residents to leave their homes only to have them killed on the road, especially if a storm doesn't end up being that bad? An article in HuffPost cited disaster geographer Ezra Boyd, who noted that more victims died relating to the evacuation and displacement for Hurricane Katrina than from drowning or other direct impacts.
Oh.
During Hurricane Rita in September 2005, which also affected the Houston area, government officials were heavily criticized at the time for issuing an evacuation order that saw about 2.5 million people hit the road at the same time. More than 100 deaths were linked to the evacuation itself. Dozens of people died of heat stroke waiting in traffic. A bus carrying nursing home residents exploded on Interstate 45, killing the 24 people inside. And when many residents finally returned home, they found their homes were fine and their streets were not even flooded because the fear caused by Hurricane Rita ended up being unfounded. Advancing hurricanes can change direction or lose strength, and that particular storm weakened from a Category 5 to a Category 3 by the time it actually hit East Texas.
Now some of that may not have been able to be properly anticipated. Like, it's not to say that there was necessarily an error made in calling that evacuation.
Right. But any decision Adam made on evacuation plans not only has financial, but obviously political implications that will undermine the credibility of agencies that call for them. Now, Rita caused officials to look at changing laws and programs around evacuations. In many cases, vertical evacuation, or in other words, get to the second floor of your house if you have one, are better than trying to disperse millions of people throughout a region until more information is available and the people who need help can actually be selectively targeted. The Houston police chief was asked by a Fox anchor whether he thought it was a mistake not to order an evacuation ahead of Hurricane Harvey, and his reply, "Oh Lord, you know I love the backseat quarterbacks. I absolutely support the decision of our mayor and the county judge to not evacuate. Where do you take 6.5 million people? Where do you send them? Especially in a state that is so prone to flash floods on our highways. We haven't been able to get resources here because highways have been blocked throughout the state of Texas. So I don't think they understand the complexity. They don't understand just how widespread this entire emergency has been." Now, forecasters expect parts of Houston to see 50 inches of rainfall by mid this week, which is insane. But Pat, I think you were saying they may have already got there today?
I saw today that it was over 49.
Wow. Harris County officials who oversee Houston have since issued a voluntary evacuation for specific subdivisions, and one neighborhood is under a mandatory evacuation. I've personally never been through anything as dramatic as the residents of Houston are experiencing, and it really is truly heartbreaking. But if it's any small consolation, officials use all the information, data, and tools at their disposal to make these really difficult calls. And if there's any silver lining, researchers say that new data from the outcome of how things were handled in Houston can be used to improve evacuations in future.
Which is obviously very good. I mean, no matter what, you could just imagine there's a grid of like, do you call the evacuation? Do you not? Is it going to actually be valid? Is it not? And you're not going to get the right quadrant all the time just because it's also probabilistic.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I was inspired to do this specifically from that Twitter back and forth because, again, it is really easy for people to say, hey, you should have done this or you shouldn't have done that. And they just don't have all the facts and all the information to make those decisions.
I mean, it's always going to be a risk-based call, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. It sounds like in a lot of cases an evacuation can kill more people than not evacuating. So that's really tricky.
Thank you, Cristina, for highlighting the very important pros and cons of a complicated decision any elected official is going to have to make. For those who are observing this horrible situation that's going on in various parts of Texas and want to help, I want to reiterate some ideas that I've talked about on previous shows, episode 401 and episode 347, which has to do with how we might be able to help during times of disasters in other places. The main message is try to channel your good intentions into something that might actually be useful to the people who are currently suffering whatever tragedy is occurring. Meaning, don't just send them goods unless there's a specific call for that type of good that's being done by a reputable agency. Sometimes people think, oh, people might need food or water or clothing, and they might, but it doesn't mean you should send it to them. You can then channel your energy or money to an organization which might be able to do things on the ground much better than you can. So people have good intentions, but try to think about how that might actually affect people and not create more problems for people. Because there's been numerous instances where tons of clothing's been donated and then it's in a warehouse somewhere, or food goes bad along the way, or people just can't get what they need, or it costs more to ship it than it would have to buy it locally. Start with your heart, but give with your head.
I think you said, Darren, in the latest one when we were talking about Fort McMurray, that you going and buying food, that an agency can actually do 5 times as much good with the money that you spent.
That's definitely true for something like the food bank, and it's hard to know. It might be true in certain disaster situations in the sense that you never know what the local market conditions suddenly become if food becomes more scarce. Either way, an agency which has more logistical resources, awareness, and connections should still be able to do a better job than you can, no matter the conditions. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for listening to our hurricane-themed show, and until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, Cuboids.
Stay classy, not smart-assy.
Good night, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Outtakes.
The weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for August 29th, 1997.
1997.
Totally got you.
I'm mildly disappointed, Adam, but I'm going to see where this goes.
Disappointed that Michael Mann, the director of Heat, isn't talking about climate change.
Know that this climate scientist didn't also direct Heat.